It is really a great pleasure to welcome Jennifer Scappettone. This seems like a normal formula, but I really mean that it's an enormous pleasure for me to have her here. Jennifer is a poet, a translator, and an exceptional scholar. She's professor of English and Romance languages at the University of Chicago. I would also like to acknowledge Isabella Livorni, who teaches at NYU and also has worked and is working on Amelia Rosselli. So much of what we do at Centro Primo Levi has to do really with personal relationships. So allow me to share a few words about my first encounter with Jennifer's work and Amelia Rosselli. So I spent a decade, the 80s, in Rome, pursuing my cultural interest, especially in theater, and researching aspects of my father's life. He had died when I was an adolescent. My family and the Rossellis had deep friendship and kinship ties. Amelia, known in the family as Melina, was born, as many of you know, in 1930, and she was the daughter of Carlo Rosselli and the British activist Marion Cave. Very briefly, for those who don't know, her father and uncle Carlo and Nello Rosselli were leading opponents of Mussolini and were murdered in the resort town of Bagnols de l'Orne in Normandy in 1937. So Amelia was 7 when her father was murdered. After periods of exile in France, England, and the US, she settled in Rome and pursued her passion for avant-garde music, ethnomusicology, and poetry. Soon after I moved to Rome in the 80s, I went to see her. I was deeply moved and intrigued and at times perplexed by her poetry. To put it very simply, I was captivated by her rigorous and passionate exploration of how words, sometimes across languages, together with sound and rhythm, create meaning. Initially, I went to see her in her attic apartment in Via del Corallo, drawn by her theatrical collaborations in the 1960s with Aldo Braibanti and through him with Carmelo Bene. Only after talking to her at length about that did we start to talk about her poetry. And for about 8 years, I frequent her with some regularity. A few years after Rosselli's suicide in 1996, a close friend of mine, Donato Colli, told me of a young American poet he had met who was researching Amelia Rosselli. Her name was Jennifer Scappettone. As I said, everything is personal connections. So some of you might remember a few months ago we had a talk here about Adelphi, the publishing house, and I was talking very passionately about Giorgio Colli, who's a major Nietzsche scholar and philosopher, and a huge influence on my life. He was Donato's father, who was the person who introduced me to Jennifer. Fast forward to 2012, Jennifer published Locomotrix, which is a selection of prose and poetry, bilingual edition of her translations of Amelia Rosselli. It was immediately clear to me that she wasn't just the translator selecting some works, but a poet who had found really profound resonance in Rosselli's writing. The book revealed an extraordinary intuition about the interconnections between her work, her biography, and her political stance. So I interviewed Jennifer for our magazine at the time, and the more we talked, the more it was clear to me how deeply personal Rosselli's work is to Jennifer then and now. While I really hesitate to make comparisons about these things, but I really think that her interest in her work on Rosselli reminds me of John Cage speaking about Eric Satie, two kindred spirits across time and space. And so anyway, several years later, I invited her to a lecture series that I curated at the Italian Cultural Institute of Giorgio Van Straten about exile and creativity, and here we are today. So her work has since branched in many directions. Her latest book is Poetry After Barbarism, The Invention of Motherless Tongues and Resistance to Fascism. In it, she explores poetry that resists the idea of language and nationality. She examines poetry written between languages by people who use more than one language or lack a single mother tongue. She defines this as xenoglossic poetics. I will leave it to her to describe this very daring, theoretically rich book.
I don't want to get teary-eyed, so I'm not going to say that much. I'm just very happy to be here, and I've been in New York for 3 days, and every day has been a little bit of a this is my life situation, you know, with people from different aspects of my life, poetry, translation, and scholarship, and this book is really the synthesis of all three of those, and it really does come out of my encounter with Amelia Rosselli in the year 2000 when I started doing a translation workshop with the great writer Anne Carson. And that was a fateful event, as it turns out. I never really have stopped being enthralled by Amelia Rosselli's work, and it continues to wend its way into my own poetics. And I continue to learn new things about it. So today I'll focus, you know, I will tell you a little bit about the book as a whole, place it in the context of New York, and maybe you'll see why I'm so happy to be in New York presenting this. And then in the end, I'll read some translations, and you know, the process of translating Amelia Rosselli is one that is infinite, particularly in her case, although one could say that the work of translation is infinite, you know, tout court. When Henry James returned to his birthplace of New York in 1904 after 20 years as expatriate in Europe, in travel writings that would be collected under the title The American Scene, the great prose stylist registered astonishment at the radical changes in the city's look and sound, of the cheerful hum of that Babel of tongues in Central Park, reflecting successive waves of recent immigration. Though clearly disquieted in the face of this metamorphic soundscape, James understood that this vast convocation of strangers was bound to forge an idiom inscrutable to him, fantastic and abracadabrant, belonging to no known language. James's vision manifested the utopian promise of the ethnic synthesis on display in the transcultural metropolis, the accent of the very ultimate future, destined to become the very music of humanity that would materialize in the century to come, through forms as different as skyscrapers of Babel and the wireless global village, and an anxiety surrounding the integrity of national languages legible in xenophobic political motions from the 1907 Dillingham Commission to the 2017 RAISE Act, both aimed at restricting U.S. immigration by privileging applicants literate in English, or the 2025 executive order designating English as the one and only one national language for the first time in this country's history. Artists across the globe who embraced the linguistic welter being generated by mass immigration would consummate James's predictions through poetic experimentation. The year James's reflections were published, both references to the myth of Babel and compensatory dreams of a common language were on the rise. In 1905, the First World Congress of Esperanto was convened on the verge of the English Channel in France, and the word xenoglossic was coined to denote the intelligible use of natural languages never learned, granting a scientific name to a phenomenon described in the story of Pentecost, a chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, in which a great wind, sometimes known as the Holy Spirit, grants Christ's followers the sudden ability to preach in all the world's languages, healing the linguistic and cultural shattering of Babel. While Doctoro Esperanto was presenting the case for an artificial universal language to an audience of linguists, diplomats, and logicians, a multiracial, multi-ethnic group of people in Los Angeles from a wide range of classes to be recognized as the first Pentecostals, led by the African-American preacher William Seymour on Bonnie Bray Street and then on Azusa Street in LA, was testifying to gifts of the Holy Ghost, claiming the sudden ability to speak in a range of foreign languages and to play musical instruments without instruction. In testifying to channeling a weird babble of tongues, these gatherings of what is now known as the Azusa Street Revival came under attack for disgraceful intermingling of the races. Xenoglossia has rarely, if ever, been mobilized as a secular concept, despite its unmistakable socio-political implications. It represents the incorporation of natural languages by people perceived to be lacking the proper education or the birthright. My new book charts the fugitive and dynamic mode of citizenship embedded in xenoglossic poetic language, language crossing national lines, resisting the jingoistic monolingual agendas that mushroomed and are mushrooming under fascism. The artworks explored host a formative, if fleeting, poetics that undermines the homogeneous definitions of community innate to modern geopolitics. This poetic world-making takes places in zones where languages stretch and contaminate one another, modeling paths toward alternative republics, republics in which poetry and its undervalued kith, translation, might assume a central agency. Naming this work xenoglossic, I distinguish it from the reputedly seamless code switching of bilingual natives or the polished multilingualism of cosmopolitan travelers. Both poles of polyglot practice implying unmarked fluency have dominated discussions of multilingual literature to this point. Understanding fascist counter-revolutions of language and culture, including Italian fascist precedents that have received less attention than those of Nazism, is essential if we are to resist the tragedy or farce of permitting history to repeat itself once again. And poetry constitutes an unembedded matrix of resistance that clarifies these ideologies through antagonism to the language in which they are grown. We must exceed the terms of a collective education that permitted us to end up in the current state of affairs scarcely 8 decades later, in order to analyze rather than being stupefied by contemporary fascist manifestations, and to invent a shared language in which to rebuke them in the current day. Fascism relies on impoverishing the citizenry's linguistic and cultural resources, tactics visible in the defense of the Italian language via autarky, beginning shortly after Mussolini's 1922 March on Rome. And here we're seeing this book, Autarchia della Lingua, the autarky of language, which is a concept that's just impossible in and of itself, and in which F.T. Marinetti has participated. The great experimentalist is signing off on this. And in this visual poem, we're seeing the second wave futurist Fortunato De Pero in New York, state of mind in New York, and he's trying to steady himself against the contamination of his head by Cinese, Russo, Francese. So it's just dramatizing the sort of embattled fascist in New York, at once recognizing all the different languages that are in the soundscape and trying to sort of steady himself. And you can see that there's the word fermo, so, you know, steady, firm, on his forehead. And this looks a lot like the face of Mussolini that I just showed you on the Palazzo Braschi, but there's a doubling there, and so it's almost as though he's vibrating. So that will become important as I begin to talk about Amelia Rosselli.
It's also a word for arrest, fermo. Fermo di polizia.
Yes, so it's like really, and then you also see the axe here and the fasces, so there's a very clear outline of this sort of containing fascist symbology and the way in which the presence, the co-presence of all these foreign languages is disturbing that. It's like rattling. I focus on poets who, though lacking a common geopolitical identity, share the condition of having been molded negatively by nationalism in its most virulent and essentially modern form, as a tribal myth predicated on the homogenization of an ineluctably mixed race, language, and culture. I exhume from these authors a solidarity and kinship of orphans whose works constitute testing grounds for future-oriented poetics, for some counter to that endpoint of romantic nationalism after which Theodor Adorno declared the composition of lyric poetry to be barbaric. My new book represents the extension of my 2012 book, Locomotrix, following a dozen years of research toward a critical introduction to and translations of Amelia Rosselli, a poet musicologist who considered herself to lack a mother tongue, having been born into exile from European fascism in Paris and educated between France, London, and New York. Her father and uncle, assassinated in Normandy in 1937 for their leading roles in the global anti-fascist resistance, I had still not exhausted key questions opened up by her invention of a cubic poetic stanza aimed at hosting all possible rhythms of all possible languages. Is it possible to forge a universal poetry in a world of divisive national idioms, haunted by the specter of fascism? Are poets who transgress national grammars capable of quashing political boundaries between cultures, or are they fated to the status of the barbarian? Lacking a mother tongue, Rosselli invented the cube form to harmonize roiling linguistic energies within her stanzas. Her work has been discussed as multilingual, composed across French, English, and Italian, yet her translingual poetics are more disconcerting than the epic montages of foreign phrases of the sort that she encountered in Anglophone modernists like Ezra Pound and rejected. To distinguish xenoglossic poetics, we have to apprehend a more subtle discomposure of poems that appear to be composed in a single language. To grant you a sense of how they sound and feel, I will play the voice of Amelia reciting a poem composed in English.
What walk those tender, heavy, fat hands? Said the executioner, the hatchet fell down upon that bodily stripped souls fermenting in the dust. You are a stranger here, and have no place among us. We would have you off our list of potent-able men, were it not that you've never belonged to it. Smell the cool, sweet fragrance of the incense burned in honor of some secret soul gone off to enjoy an hour's agony with our saintly maker. Play Buick, sang the hatchet as it cut slittingly purpled with blood. The earth is made nearly round, and fuel is burned every day of our lives.
Okay, so there's so much to say about the poem. There are strangenesses such as the, purpled with blood rather than reddened with blood. Their bodily stripped souls, the way that just a native speaker wouldn't think to put the word bodily there. There are just these sort of maneuvers, both syntactically and in terms of, lexically, that are strange. But I wanted you to hear the way that her accent is sort of between accents. And one of the things I write about in the chapter is how if you talk to an Italian, she has a French accent. If you talk to a French person, she has an English accent. It's just, and they want to decide, but it's always other than the accent that is the standard Albion voice of that particular nation state. And then there is her manner of recitation, which really is somewhere between the liturgical chant. She would play organ in the churches of Rome, so she was connected to that, the tradition of the sound of the church, and just music. And it was something that she carried with her through decades, and no one in the literary scene understood what on earth she was talking about. That is my reading of it. And she kept trying to send this essay to different people around the world, and both the fact that she was a woman, for various reasons, she really was not recognized as latching onto something that was really in the avant-garde.
I must say that in the 70s, she started giving more frequent public readings in Italy, and the people who heard her recite all had the same, very similar reaction of not knowing whether she was singing or reciting or praying, and the effect for most people, for most audience, even in a festival setting, was everybody was very quiet and really listening to attentively. They didn't really fully recognize it as poetry nor as Italian, but everybody felt that there was a musical quality that was very strong.
Right. So there was one literary festival at Castel Porziano, and it was famously rowdy. That the audience was very upset. They were throwing things at the stage, and it was just, there was this kind of real gap between the public and the art, and she got up there and started reciting, and I've heard it. The crowd just goes dead silent. That was it, all the rowdiness just ceased. I would have done anything to be there. I was probably not yet born, or I was like, but,
And
so,
there was also the thing of, she was grappling with mental disease, so it's also the point in which people don't know, is she crazy, is she singing, is she praying? But this attributing her this idea of a mad poet has a lot to do with mystique and misunderstanding of what she was doing.
Absolutely.
And what? No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. No.
No, I mean, I think it didn't matter, though, what she said, because the force of the patriarchy and, any number of things, also xenophobia toward a person who ironically has that accent because her father was assassinated trying to liberate Italy from fascism. So that is one of those paradoxes that I will never stop being fascinated and depressed by.
Well, since I interrupted you already, Jennifer showed us a cover, very important book of hers, Serie Ospedaliera. Now, as she, Jennifer can speak about her reception as a poet in Italy at the time. Now, we're talking about 30 years after her death. But this, at the time, very few Italian poets took her seriously. One of the first, in a controversial and complicated way, was Pasolini. So this book, I think, is 69. Is that correct?
Yeah, 69.
Yes. So this is the cover. Oh, you could see it there. Yes. Okay. So Pasolini, in 1973, published with Garzanti a book called Calderon. Now look at the cover.
Weird.
And this is so. Anyway, so I think that what comes out of a lot of Jennifer's writing is this very subtle way in which Amelia Rosselli weaved herself into Italian consciousness and then international audience. And it's so not linear and unpredictable. And so for so long, she was part of the anthologies of contemporary Italian poetry, but such an anomaly, so different, and so not of a school or of a movement that people really didn't know what to do with her. And I think that in some kind of a paradoxical way, for scholars here, somebody like Jennifer also, Isabella, writing about her from here is easier than to do it in Italy, where inevitably her output is squashed by knowledge of this very famous father and uncle.
Yeah, and part of why I started this work was that I sort of resented how her father and uncle's work was discussed in isolation from her work. Her work was poetry, and maybe in a way it wasn't even poetry. It was really like on the lunatic fringe because it was so avant-garde, really. That's one way that you can explain it. I present the harmonic atmosphere as a way of reading Rosselli's voice, its hauntings, its aura of other tongues perpetually marginalized under the category of the off-key foreign accent. Volai, caddi tremante nelle braccia di Dio, e che quest'ultimo sospiro sia tutto il mio essere, e che l'onda premi stretti in difficile unione il mio sangue, e da quell'inganno supremo mi si renda la morte divenuta vermiglia, ed io che dalle commosse risse dei miei compagni staccavo quell'ansia di morire, godrò infine l'era della ragione, e che tutti i fiori bianchi della riviera e che tutto il peso di Dio battano sulle mie prigioni. I fell a tremble into the arms of God. And may this final sigh be my entire being, and may the wave a bounty, straits in difficult union, my blood. And from that supreme ruse may death become vermilion be rendered me. And I, who from the ardent riots of my comrades detached that anxiousness to die, will relish at last the age of reason. And may all the white Riviera flowers and all the weight of God beat at my prisons. Poetry may seem the most abject of genres when it comes to resisting fascism. Poetry that inspires knee-jerk responses of being difficult, off-key, awkward, and wrong will certainly appear ever so much more powerless to skeptical readers. In resisting reigning languages of clarity, however, this poetry casts out into public discourse critical remnants of freedom, of tendencies toward real humanity, as Horkheimer and Adorno put it, remnants true to the fracas within us, one that resists incorporation by the authoritarian state apparatus, even though it may seem powerless in the face of the great historical trend.
Jennifer really, I think, underscores the political importance and impact of her work, something that for half a century almost nobody in Italy caught. For those who don't know, Carlo Rosselli was a very important political thinker. He was the leader of a movement, Giustizia e Libertà, which was a main non-Marxist left-wing opposition to Mussolini. So immediately after the war, but even during the war, the communist leader, Togliatti, had a particular fear of what this, Italians love martyrs. So this martyred non-Marxist, what could this legacy lead to? And so the main theoretical book by Carlo Rosselli is called Socialismo Liberale. It was written actually at the time of her Amelia's birth, no more or less. In any case,
it was hidden in a piano.
Exactly. And this book, which is so the communist leader Togliatti referred to this book for 20 years as quel libello. Now, libello in Italian means little unimportant booklet. Okay? So, when Amelia Rosselli wrote, which one of her most clearly, one of her long poems that's clearly confronting her father, it's called La Libellula, the dragonfly, Panegirico della Libertà, panegyric for freedom. This little book, La Libellula, this is in Italian. If you can hear the sound, is exactly what she's talking about. So she takes libello, which is this diminutive idea in which Togliatti was trying to destroy the political significance of the father, and she made it La Libellula, making it feminine. And so in English, obviously, this is hard to understand, and Dragonfly does not capture that. But for an Italian audience, for particularly an Italian audience at the time, it was a very, very big thing. It was also very important that the remnants, or what the Socialist Party had became by the 60s, because of her last name, they were trying to get her to participate actively to political activities. She was much closer to the communist, if anyone. And so that this tension, I think, is a key thing to understand this thing. And I think that in reality, to my knowledge, Jennifer is the only critic of Rosselli to have understood how much of how this poetry is both political and really a response to this absent father.
Poetry is political because it works on the language. I mean, there are poetries that rest well and are complicit with the reigning languages of power, but those are not the poems that I am interested in. So this avant-garde that has been so trashed and so forth, I'm still committed to the idea of experimentation with language, because I believe, what Horkheimer and Adorno say, that if you're speaking the language of power, it's very hard to, upset the power structures upon which this power is based. The very word barbarism, barbarous, is already so freighted by an ideology of the foreigner. It comes from the way that the Persians sounded to the Greeks. Bar, bar, bar. And so, it's already a xenophobic term in and of itself. So the notion of poetry after barbarism is not to say that the barbarism of fascism is over, but that this poetry exists in a world after the category of the barbaric has been devastated.